All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into something that a lot of people think is super straightforward, but is actually packed with legal tripwires. We're talking about when growing cannabis in California stops being legal and crosses the line into a felony. The answer can literally change someone's life, and it's all buried in the fine print of the law. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's just start with the big question. Growing weed in California is legal, right? Well, yes and no. It's one of those things where the answer is it's complicated. It's definitely not a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. The whole thing is a maze of rules and exceptions, and if you take one wrong turn, you could find yourself facing a felony charge. So to really get our heads around how something that's supposed to be legal can suddenly flip into a felony, we got to start at the source. And that source is a specific law, Health and Safety Code 1135-8. This is the bedrock of California's cultivation laws, and it's where our whole story really begins. Okay, now look closely at the actual text of the law. It's kind of wild, right? It starts off by basically saying, nope, you can't do any of it. Planting, growing, harvesting, the whole shebang. It's all illegal. But then you get to this little phrase at the very end, except as otherwise provided by law. And that, right there, is the magic key. It's the loophole, the little crack in the door that makes legal cultivation possible. And that little exception, that's what leads us to the rule almost everyone's heard of, the 6-plant limit. But here's the thing, it is not as simple as just counting to 6. Nope, the penalties change big time depending on your age and just how many plants we're talking about. So check out this table, it lays it all out pretty clearly. If you're between 18 and 20 and you've got 6 plants or less, it's basically a slap on the wrist, an infraction like a parking ticket. But look what happens the second you go over that 6-plant limit if you're an adult. Bam, it jumps straight to a misdemeanor, and now you're looking at potential jail time. This is the baseline for most of these cases. Okay, so that leads us to the million-dollar question, right? If growing 7 or 8 or 10 plants is just a misdemeanor, where on earth does a felony charge come from? There has to be some kind of legal trigger that just blows the stakes wide open. Well, that's where we get into something called the aggravated pathway. It's a specific section of the law that acts like a tripwire, turning a standard misdemeanor into a really, really serious felony. This is where the game completely changes. Yeah, think of this part of the law as like a penalty multiplier. The act itself, growing more than 6 plants, doesn't change. But this section looks at your personal history, and if it finds certain things in your past, it hits an upgrade button on the consequences, taking it all the way up to a felony. And the law is super, super specific about what pulls this trigger. It's not just any old criminal record. We're talking about 2 very distinct situations. Either you have a prior conviction for what's called a super strike, we're talking extremely serious felonies here, or you are required to register as a sex offender. That's it. Those are the 2 conditions that can escalate this in a hurry. Now, just a quick heads up, this isn't the only way a cultivation case can jump to a felony. If you're, say, dumping chemicals and doing massive damage to the environment, yeah, that can get you there too. But for this explainer, we're really zeroing in on this prior conviction trigger, because it's a super common way people get caught. All right, so we've got the what of the law down. Now let's talk about the how. Like, what does this actually look like when someone gets arrested? Let's walk through the real-world process. You know, when police show up to a house for a cultivation issue, they're not just there with a clicker counting plants. They're looking at the whole picture. And if they see things like sketchy wiring to steal power or weapons lying around, or even just a bunch of cash and baggies, well, those are huge red flags. It tells them this might be a lot bigger than just personal use. And that's when things really escalate. And once that arrest happens, man, the system moves fast. First, you've got booking. Then, the case file lands on a prosecutor's desk, and they decide what charges to officially file. After that, bail gets set, and for these felony-level cases, it can be sky high. And all of that leads to your first day in court, the arraignment. It's a very structured process, but for the person going through it, it can feel like total chaos. Okay, so now we're in the court system, and at this point, the whole case can really turn on just a few key details. Think of them like weak spots in the prosecution's argument, places that can be challenged. First up, and this might sound a little weird, is the plant count itself. I mean, how hard can that be, right? But the law is extremely specific here. The prosecutor has to prove there were more than 6 living cannabis plants. And that one word, living, is where a good defense lawyer can really dig in. I mean, what is a living plant? Legally speaking, is a tiny little seedling a plant? What about a cutting that hasn't even rooted yet? It might seem like splitting hairs, but if you can argue the count down below 7, the whole nature of the case can change. Next up is a huge one. Who was actually in charge? See, it's not illegal to just be in the same house as some pot plants. The prosecution has to prove you knew they were there and that you were the one in control of them. Yeah, this idea of control is everything. Were you the person who actually lived there? Were you just visiting a friend for the weekend? Or maybe you were just getting paid a few bucks to water them. Proving who was really running the show is a massive hurdle for the prosecution, and if they can't do it, their case can fall apart. And finally, let's circle all the way back to that felony trigger we talked about. For that charge to actually stick, the DA has to prove that the prior conviction they're using is the real deal, that it's accurate, and that it legally fits the very specific definition in the statute. And this quote really sums it up perfectly. The entire felony charge is built on that prior history. If there's a mistake in the paperwork, or if the old crime doesn't quite fit the legal definition for the upgrade, that whole felony pathway can just disappear. Poof, it's gone, and you're back to a misdemeanor fees. So, wow, we started with what seemed like a simple question, right? Is it legal? And we've ended up deep in the weeds of the law, where the line between a minor fine and a life-changing felony can hinge on something that happened years ago. It really makes you think, as these laws keep changing, where do we draw that line between personal freedom and public safety? It's a tough question, and there's definitely no easy answer.